This is something that I might have vaguely mentioned on the main channel, but right before I started out on YouTube, I used to work in the TV industry here in Quebec for about 5 years, from 2016 to 2021. And for today's story, I want to talk about my time in that industry and share the utter embarrassment of how I ended up leaving. So I was primarily an assistant editor, and I worked on various projects ranging from TV dramas and reality TV, but mostly tons of subsidized documentaries. I'd like to say it was fairly glamorous, and if you've either been in the TV or movie industry yourself, you probably got the impression from friends and family that they think just you being in those industries and working on the stuff they end up seeing on TV is pretty awesome, but most of the time, it really isn't as great as it sounds. Work on production sets, for example, can be absolutely brutal. Depending on your department, you could be the first on set at 4 or 5 in the morning because special effects makeup takes 3 hours to apply and they're hoping to start recording at 8. And you might be there until well into the evening depending on possible delays and other issues, often for weeks on end. Which is why I, when coming out of film school, went straight into post-production as working an office job sounded way easier. Now, if you don't know what an assistant editor, or AE for short, is, I don't blame you, as we tend to work in the shadows, sometimes literally. But basically, you know the editor, the person in charge of cutting the movie and putting it together from start to finish. Usually the AE's job is to basically do all the non-editing work in between. Because the footage doesn't go directly from the set straight to the editor. The footage needs to be processed, which in itself can entail everything from copying all the footage into a more flexible format to make editing smoother, a process known as transcoding. The audio is pretty much always recorded separately, so it needs to be synchronized with the video, and depending on what the project is, the editor will often want all of the footage to be divided by scenes, and in chronological order, since nothing is ever shot chronologically. And so all this prep is usually done by the assistant editor. Also worth noting that the editor doesn't mix the film or does the color grading. Those are different post-production departments, and usually the assistant editor is the one sending the cut of the movie to those departments with the specifications required for them to work, and it's also the AE that brings the audio mix and colored footage into the movie to make the final delivery. Essentially, the AE isn't really assisting the editor in his work as much as carrying the project through each step of post-production, which is really crucial, because in my experience, a lot of editors have very little understanding of all the technical stuff that goes into the process, and they have no clue what they're doing outside of editing itself. As to what projects I worked on, probably none that you've heard of. As I've said, I worked in the Quebec TV industry, which is not only fairly small, we also don't tend to export a lot of our works internationally. That said, we have our own knockoffs of more popular shows, and we do have our own local celebrities, so here's a few things I worked on. For starters, I worked on the French edition of The Voice, which we do have in Quebec, and was hosted by some of our more popular singers the year I worked on it, but they also started The Voice Kids that same year, so I worked on the very first season. Mike Ward is a popular comedian here in Quebec that also performs in English abroad, and he had a stand-up show on one of the main networks for a year, which I worked on. One of the biggest TV dramas we had for a while was 31st Precinct. It's basically a cop show like Law & Order with lots of dramas and intrigues, and I worked on the 3rd season while it was still running. One of our rising stars in the past few years has been Ludivine Redding, who got critical acclaim starring in Fugueuse, which was a drama on human trafficking. And although I didn't work on Fugueuse, the following year she starred in another drama called Clash, of which I worked on the first 2 seasons. Here we are together at a party where I got to hang out with the whole cast. This is something I did a few times, so here I am with some cast members from 31st Precinct as well. And those are the main shows that I bring up when people ask me what I worked on, because they're more likely to know what they are. But the truth is, for every somewhat glamorous show I worked on, there must have been at least 20 projects that nobody really cared about. For a while I worked on a whole bunch of cooking shows, for example, for the one TV channel that is exclusively dedicated to cooking, and I mean, they all felt like the same to me. I also worked on a lot of documentaries that I felt were tremendously boring, and those made up the bulk of my time in the industry. Now, I did mention early on that the work in the TV industry can be anything but amazing, and in fact can be extremely hard, but that really depends on what department you work on, and even then based on what time of the year. This was especially true in post-production. When it comes to production, as in the work being done on set, the media industry in Quebec is split in two. There's what we produce locally, and then there's all the big American productions. American studios very often come to Montreal to shoot their movies, as it's much cheaper for them than to work in New York. However, we have fairly strong unions in the industry, and they've made sure that whenever an American production comes here, they can only work with local crews. So there's a lot of work there for sure, but it mostly impacts the production department, as usually those same movies are edited in the States with their own people. The other part is what we do locally, and virtually all productions that don't work all year round instead work around specific seasons, meaning most movies and TV shows are shot in the summer when the weather is most optimal, and they're edited in fall and winter. So for post-production workers like myself, either you would find steady work somewhere that kept you busy for the whole year, which was very rare and difficult to find, or you had periods where you don't really work, followed by periods when you work like crazy, which is what a lot of people ended up doing. I would usually become a workaholic from midsummer to midwinter, and usually from February to July, I had made so much money I could just sit on it and do nothing for a few months. And I was barely 20 years old at the time. I was single and living on my own with virtually no responsibilities, so I was having a time of my life with those crazy routines. There was also the novelty of my field. I enjoyed working on multiple shows for different companies, and I enjoyed just learning everything on the job. Although the craziest routine I had for a while during my first post-production season is that I worked at 3 main places at once. During the day I worked at that one company full-time, but for a few evenings per week and one day during the weekend, I was working on this other show at a second company. And to really finish me off, because I didn't know how much I could take, the Mike Ward show I was talking about earlier, they shot 4 episodes per week, but they shot all of them on the same Tuesday night every week, and they needed all the footage prepped and ready for editing by Wednesday morning. The job wasn't difficult on its own, except for the fact that for one night in the week, I was doing an all-nighter on that one show. So I'd work from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at one place on Tuesday, and then from 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. I was working on the Mike Ward show. I would then rush home to get maybe 3 hours of sleep before doing another 1 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift on Wednesday. So that one night shift in the middle of the week would absolutely wreck me. And this crazy routine, during which I sporadically worked at other places as well, went from September of 2016 to the New Year's, at which point I took a break and developed carpal tunnel syndrome in both wrists, from sitting at different desks, all with the worst ergonomics than the next. What I will say though, and this was a recurrent theme of working in post-production and something I really loved, it's that in a lot of places, work really wasn't about starting and leaving at a specific time. For a lot of post-production companies, you had tons of freedoms when it came to your own schedule, as generally, they were much less interested in seeing you at specific times, and more interested in getting the product delivered on time. So if, for example, I received footage for a documentary and it had to be prepped for editing, but the editor didn't start work until next week, if I wanted to show up at 11 at night to prep it, they didn't care. I had my own key to the office. I could look at the work and think that it'll take maybe 4 hours to prep, so whether I do it right away or tomorrow or last minute, nobody cared, as long as it was done on time. This is what actually made it possible for me to keep accepting more contracts. I could just look at what needed to be done, and if something new popped up, I could text a post-production coordinator and be like, hey, that thing you wanted me to do for Thursday, I'm not gonna do it today because something else came up, so I'll do it tomorrow instead. And they'd be like, okay, no problem, as long as it's ready for Thursday. It was very nonchalant is my point, in a way that I really enjoyed. Similarly, I was working in a field that included a lot of artists from different departments, which meant often working with a lot of flamboyant, chaotic people. And so there was no real strict sense of conduct. We could dress very casually, we were all very friendly towards each other, and no one really cared for professionalism. I could show up to a job interview wearing a Batman t-shirt, I wouldn't really sit straight, and we'd talk to each other like we were already buddies, and I'd get the job anyway. Definitely one of the aspects I miss from the industry. And so I did this seasonal routine for about 3 years. I got pretty bad carpal tunnel from it, but hey, the breaks I got afterwards of living by myself and sitting on the money for months on end were pretty awesome too. Initially, I was pretty excited about working in the industry, but the truth is, it was never really what I wanted. What I wanted to be when I went to film school is a film director. Since high school, I had directed my own amateur movies, many of them in fact, and I just wanted to be the next Quentin Tarantino. Being an assistant editor was mostly just about stepping foot in the industry and seeing what it was like, but the progress I had made in my career mostly steered me towards becoming an editor in post-production. I was nowhere near any opportunities of directing anything, and even becoming a film editor was a long shot. A big problem the industry was having, and I suspect is still having today, is that there is a lot of editors and too few AEs. AEs want to be editors because it pays better, but because there were more editors than work, the prospect of being an editor at all was pretty slim. Actually, editors themselves at the time could be split into categories. There were the editors who basically picked whatever gigs they could get, and then there were the boomers, the veterans, the ones who were comfortable at the top with the best editing gigs like movies and TV series. The one time I got to see the latter was when working on 31st Precinct. The production company that made that show was one of the biggest ones in the city in terms of producing movies and dramas, And virtually all of the editors had been working there with the producer, Fabienne Larouche, since the late 1990s. So those were pretty secure jobs, and there never was going to be an opening until either one of the editors retired or died. And don't get me wrong, I got to work with them and they were very nice people, but some of them hadn't learned to use a computer since Windows 95, and outside of editing itself, they barely knew what they were doing, which was frustrating to see because I very much felt capable of doing their jobs, but they had them for over 20 years and they were not budging. So as an assistant editor working there, I basically learned that if I was not going to be the next Quentin Tarantino and would have to settle to be the next Quentin Tarantino editor, as in editing for movies and shit, the best hope I have is to stay there as an assistant editor for at least another decade and take what little opportunities are offered to do editing until someone finally retires and I get their seat. And outside of those specific production companies, if I wanted to become a full-time editor, I'd have to fight with all the other editors for whatever gig is available. And we're not talking dramas here, but cooking shows, documentaries, reality TV, and well, let me tell you something about that. One of the first contracts I got was on a show that is still running to this day called Arrive en campagne, which I would roughly translate to Going Rural. It's a show where every episode they take a family from the city and make them work on a farm for a weekend. And we learn at the same time how those farms operate. It's an interesting show, it's not bad, it's not my thing. But when I was working on the second season, they were looking to make promotional clips to put online, and they gave me the opportunity to edit those myself, which I was totally down for. The first clip I had to edit was a simple game where they blindfolded the two families and had them eat different types of corn and they had to guess which they were by taste alone. So I edited it and I sent it to the director for approval, and then he calls me. And what he says essentially is that, yeah, it's good, but it's not dramatic enough. Not dramatic enough? People eating corn for a 1-minute promotional clip is not dramatic enough. From this I learned two things. First, I learned that this director was absolutely the guy for the job. If he had the passion for something that I felt was so trivial, then he was excellent. And I learned from myself that even though I enjoy editing, if I don't have the passion for a project, not only will it not be the best work I can do, I will lose my soul doing that work full time. I mean, to be clear, in the case of this clip, he had me do adjustments to the editing and it did come out better, but the point is, the prospect of fighting with other editors for the opportunity of editing entire episodes and series of this stuff just didn't appeal to me at all. But with the career I had picked, those were my two options. Either stick to a job for at least a decade in hopes of getting straight to the good stuff, or fight over content that I have no interest in editing. Neither of which brought me any closer to becoming a film director. For that, I would have had to make a complete switch towards working on the set, and I didn't want to start all over again either. So instead, by 2019, I opted for another option that a lot of people take. I decided that in order to become a director, I was going to make my own film, in my own time, with as much money as I can spare, to cut through all the career paths and hopefully carve out a path for myself. To do that though, I needed more steady work, something more stable. And so I got a steady job. There was this company hiring and they had so many productions going on at once that their post-production department was full-time for the whole year. And this is where my passion really started to fade away. This place was both the best and worst job I ever had. So starting with the good. For starters, the job was evening shifts, which were my favorite. It's during the day that people are at the office, it's during the day that editors have problems that you need to fix and all the interruptions that come with it. But when I start at 4 in the afternoon, most people are leaving by 5 and I basically have the entire office to myself and I can focus on my work with no interruptions whatsoever. But the really good thing about this job was that, as part of my contract, I was guaranteed a minimum of 6 hours paid as soon as I walked in, whether there were 6 hours worth of work or not. This was actually a very sensitive condition for them to have, because while they technically had enough work for everyone to work full-time during the day, that wasn't always the case with the evening assistant editor. But they understood that we have bills to pay, so to avoid the risk of AEs constantly leaving to get work elsewhere since the job wasn't always full-time, this policy basically ensured that the AE would stay there whether there's work or not. For me though, oh man. I did have a lot of work during certain periods of the year, but from the New Year's to June, most of my job was usually limited to prepping footage that would come in later at night so it's ready to edit the next day. And if you recall earlier, this was a job where people don't really care about when you show up as long as the work gets done. So while my schedule implied that I was showing up to work at 4 in the afternoon, most of the time I never did. I would log into the software we used internally for the workload, see what footage would be delivered that day and at what time, and if that's all there was for me to do that night, I would show up when the footage would. So if it wasn't being delivered until 8 p.m., Then that's when I would show up for work, and as usual, I had the whole place to myself, and if it took me only 2 hours to do the work, I'd leave at 10 p.m. and be paid 6 hours for my 2 hours of work. Sometimes I would show up early to do other work, but then there would be nothing to do except waiting for the footage to arrive. So here's a picture I sent my dad back then of me having Domino's Pizza after having installed Steam on the computer. Pretty sure that night I played Medieval 2 Total War while waiting for the footage to arrive. And of course I was paid for it. Sometimes we would receive footage, but the editor wouldn't necessarily start the following day. So I'd show up just to start the transcoding process of the footage, and after having started the process, which could take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours on its own, I'd just leave the computer to do its thing all night and go right back home, and be paid a full 6 hours for less than 1 hour of work. Everyone knew that's what I was doing, and nobody cared. It was part of my contract. On top of all of this, when I did see my colleagues, I would get along very well with all of them. There was no drama, no bullshit, everyone was very easygoing, I had no complaints. So at this point you might think this was easily the best job ever, and I'll agree thinking back on it that in some aspects I had it really easy with that one. But now let's get to the bad. The first issue was, and this is going to sound very trivial in contrast, but the content I was working on was some of the most boring shit I had ever worked on. Early on when I said that Quebec produces a lot of content locally, what I didn't mention is that the media industry in Quebec is by and large not profitable. We're too small of our own audience, so there's little money to be made. And as such, the government, to keep the industry going, subsidizes a lot of projects, even when they're not going to turn a profit. And as a result, there's a lot of lame, shitty shows that nobody watches that gets produced to keep people working, and this particular production company produced these types of shows almost exclusively. And I don't mean to say the shows themselves were poorly made or low quality. The people working on these shows were professionals, and they were very good at their jobs. But none of the content appealed to me. And not only was the content pretty lame, it was also explicitly milked as much as possible to keep people working as much as possible. So, say for example that you wanted to make a documentary on garbage men. You know, who they are, how they work. Unironically, I think it'd be an interesting idea to explore this field, for like a 1-hour documentary maybe. Because, why not? I'm sure there's lots of stuff people don't know about garbage men. People certainly don't know just how hard these jobs actually are. But instead of a 1-hour documentary, imagine 26 episodes of 30 minutes each. Like, you're not getting into the lives of the garbage men, there's no plot or drama, it's just like, oh, today we're emptying the trash in this neighborhood. Oh, these people left us a couch, which we're not supposed to pick up, and here's why. 26 episodes of this. And that's what I worked on, in addition to like 20 other projects of similar size and theme. That was my job over there, and it was a running gag among everyone in the department that what we worked on was really lame. One of the last shows we were going to start work on right before I left was, I think, called Dream Pools. It was literally going to be a show about pool designs. But on top of that, the job was also way more difficult than any other job I've had because of two main factors, both of which I felt were completely avoidable. And to explain them, I'm also going to have to explain the job a bit, so enjoy learning about how movies and shows work. So, starting with the first issue, the footage itself. So, as an assistant editor, the primary job when it comes to prepping the footage is to synchronize the audio and the camera, as they always record separately. This is normal, as it just allows the sound and camera departments to focus exclusively on their respective jobs. Now, when it comes to synchronizing the footage, there's 3 main ways to do it. From easiest to hardest, the first method is through the timecode, then it's the clap, or God forbid, the third method is manually, using whatever visual cues you can find. So, the timecode basically works like this. The sound console on set will generate a timecode, which is like an internal clock usually based on the time of day. Meaning that if, say, you start recording at 8 AM, the audio clip will have an internal timecode that starts at 8 o'clock. And if the camera starts at 8:02, the camera clip will have an internal timecode that starts at 8:02. So if you create an editing sequence that starts at the 8-hour mark and plays both clips on the timeline based on their starting time, they will both play at the same time, effectively synchronizing them. I'm simplifying the process here a bit, but it basically means that so long as all cameras and the sound run on the same internal clock, you can generate a sequence with a matching timecode that will cause all sources to synchronize automatically. Pretty much every production I ever worked on would set the cameras and sound this way, and it makes the synchronizing process very easy. At most, the timecode could be off by a frame or two, but you just have to tweak it manually yourself, but all in all, it's much easier. However, not all cameras are compatible with that feature. Sometimes cameras will not have the timecode built in, at which point they need to be synchronized manually, and that's where the clap comes in. You ever seen those clap thingies when they clap it in front of the camera before saying action? One of the purposes of this thing is to make a clap. The clap is loud, distinctive, and you can easily see it visually as well. So when looking at the audio waveform of the clips, it will always come out as a sharp spike, which makes it very easy to line all of the clips together. But it doesn't even need to merely be that object. A simple hand clap will achieve the exact same thing, which is what I do when I film some of my videos, since I don't plug my camera into my computer to record at the same time as my microphone. So should cameras not have a timecode, which is the case with the GoPros that are typically strapped on people or on their cars, having a clear clap, both on audio and visual, makes it easy to synchronize everything together. But what if the cameras have no timecodes and the crew doesn't even bother to start the scene with a hand clap? Then what? Well, then you're on to the third and last method, synchronizing manually, which means manually looking at the visuals and the audio waveforms to try and see how it fits. And we're typically talking hours of content here with multiple cameras. Usually when that was the case, the first thing I'd look at is the audio waveform, because even though cameras will record audio at varying quality, they're still all recording the same stuff. So you can still see patterns in the waveform and make them match. But that only works based on circumstances, because even if a GoPro captures sound, if it's right next to a truck engine, say, the audio will only pick up the loud hum of the engine and the waveform will look like this, completely unusable. To my credit, I'd say that over time I became the absolute master of manual syncing, because I was often given the worst footage in the worst conditions, and I still found ways to synchronize it all. Typically I would look for closing doors, as even though the audio spike wasn't as obvious, I could still hear it and see it. And sometimes, I just had to look at a 30-minute shot that's supposed to fit within a 40-minute sequence, so 10 minutes of margin to sort through, and it was my job to fix it. Sometimes there were only 2 GoPros, sometimes 6, sometimes 10. Most of the footage I got would include a bit of everything. The main cameras pretty much always had the timecode, but I always had to do this shit with the GoPros, which again, I'll remind you, was an easy fix if the crew just did a hand clap for me on set. But they never bothered. No matter how often my post coordinator will reach out to them, it was very inconsistent. I swear to God, one time they had rotating camera crews for this show that followed construction workers around town. One team would do the clap, and the other would not. And it even led the construction workers themselves to be confused. One of the construction workers, I remember having him on camera as they started rolling, and he asked one of the production assistants if he needed to do a hand clap for the cameras. And I shit you not, I heard the production assistant say, "Nah man, it's not necessary." And so the guy didn't. I was so mad. I extracted the clip and I sent it to the entire post-production department to point out the negligence. And they told me later that they didn't bother hiring that guy again for later gigs. And I mean, we had told them like a dozen times at least, and it still wasn't getting through. So that was one of the main issues. The job was often an absolute pain in the ass, and in a way that was very avoidable. Understand, every single time a camera crew didn't do the claps, they extended my own workload by several hours, even though it would literally just take them a few extra seconds. I can think of at least 2 occasions where it was so bad that I ended up working until 4 or 5 in the morning, even though it was supposed to be done at 10 the evening before, because the editor needed it for the next morning. And those are the extremes, but many more times I could still be working an extra 2-3 hours and finishing by midnight or 1 a.m. And that's before we get into the third and final issue, which came about a year into working there when they decided to update the editing software, but not the server software. See, in places like these, there is no local hard drives per se. All the footage, all the project files, everything is on the same server that can be accessed by all the computers. So you prep an editing project in one office, and the editor down the hall can access it right away. It's pretty standard. But it also meant that every time you opened the main editing program we had, in our case Media Composer, the Internet Explorer of editing programs, it was fairly stable, but only after it took a very long time to load, as it was also loading up the entire server to be able to access everything. But after they updated Media Composer, without also updating the program we used to browse the server, it would cause both programs to randomly fall out of sync, at which point Media Composer would completely freeze, had to be forced quit, and launched again, at which point it would scan the entire database all over again. It wasn't really a problem for the editors because they only focused on one project at a time, but as the assistant editor who managed like 10 different projects at the same time, I was switching up constantly, and as such the bug would occur easily 5 or 6 times per evening, and every time it took Media Composer a good 10 minutes to launch again, so you could widely guess that in one 6-hour shift, easily 1 hour of that was spent waiting for Media Composer to restart after it froze. So sure, I was guaranteed 6 hours of pay, and I often got to work considerably less and still be paid full time. Sure, I got along with everybody, and I had the whole office to myself pretty much all the time. And sure, sometimes I was getting paid just to wait for footage to arrive and playing on Steam in the meantime. But when I did work, it was buggy as hell, which made everything take so much more time than it should have, and I worked with the constant reminder that I'd be saving hours upon hours of work if the camera crews had the slightest decency to do a hand clap for me. And all the projects themselves were mind-numbingly boring, and I had no interest in them whatsoever. So within 2 years of working there, with all the stress and frustration that came with it, not to mention these were the years I worked my butt off trying to shoot my movie on the weekends between work weeks, and the COVID pandemic also occurred during that time, and well, it led me to just hate my job. And I'm not gonna lie, the 6 hours guaranteed was very much double-edged. It guaranteed a full-time income even on weeks and months when I wouldn't normally get that, but it also created an incentive to work faster, to be done faster. After all, if I could do 6 hours of work in 5, it just meant getting to leave earlier and still be paid the same amount of time. So the only really good shifts I had were the ones that were over the quickest. If I could get through a shift without tearing my hair out at the lack of hand claps or the server crashing and get all my work done in less than 6 hours, to me that was a good shift. But anything less than that typically costs me after a while to immediately lose my shit. Good thing I had the whole office to myself because I could seriously rage, I am not kidding. But as I started to work faster and faster, I was bound to make mistakes, and eventually I did a massive one, so here it is. It would have been right around this time of year, about 4 years ago now. I go into the office for my usual shift, and my coordinator tells me that an editor started working on this show I prepped, but there was a problem. The show had a setup of 3 cameras, but in the middle segment, one of the cameras was just a duplicate of one of the other 2, so there was a camera missing for the segment. So my first task for the day was to fix this. So I open the project and I see the mistake, except there's already a warning that this is a massive problem. Even though camera 2 is clearly the same as camera 3, I mean, it's the same angle, the same visuals, and the same length, it has a different file name. It's labeled as camera 2. So I go straight to the server, and sure enough, camera 2 is literally just a copy of camera 3. This means that when I received all the footage, which was usually like 9 SD cards, 3 for each camera, 1 per segment, I ended up copying the same card twice, simply renamed them according to the nomenclature, and I did not notice I had the same camera twice. And the missing footage for camera 2 was essentially never copied onto the server at all. Now, had the footage been prepped the day before, and the mistake had been discovered on the following day, we could simply have taken the SD cards we still had, done the copy properly, and fixed the mistake. The problem though, is that it had been prepped 3 months before. It had been 3 months since it had been shot, copied, and prepped. And since then, the SD cards had been taken back to the set to film the next episode, meaning that missing camera footage was most likely gone forever. This is all something I figured out in the first 10 minutes of starting my shift. At the time, most people were still working remotely and they had no idea what was going on. They just told me I had to fix it and to let them know when it would be. So I'm sitting in my office just contemplating everything. Understand, if it had been like a GoPro or something, maybe the editor could have managed without it, probably, but it was one of the primary cameras, and without it, the segment was going to be lacking considerably. In the worst case scenario, this means that the entire production crew has to reshoot that one segment, just because I didn't transfer the footage properly, which is like the most basic thing to do, and literally the very first step of any post-production work. Now, if the show was still running and they still had the crew and everything, that's annoying and costly, but it's manageable, because everything is still in place. They'd have to schedule an extra hour on one of the following days of filming, and just reshoot that one segment. The problem again, though, is that the show wrapped up 2 months ago. The set they rented was no longer accessible without having to rent it all over again. All the gear, all the props, everything had been stored away, and the actors had moved on to other projects. So there would be many more additional costs to bring everything back together for just one day, just to shoot a tiny segment, because again, the AE, me, failed to copy the footage properly. These are all the things running through my head as I realize my mistake. I'm alone in the office, no one knows yet. But of course, it's only a matter of time. And if you want another big twist to this story, Part of the reason in that moment that I'm understanding all of this so clearly and so quickly is because I had done the exact same mistake the year before. The exact same thing happened. I didn't copy a card properly, and we ended up losing the footage. At the time, I had gotten away with a mere slap on the wrist because the show had not wrapped up yet, and they were quickly able to reshoot the segment. And part of the otherwise very healthy work culture over there was that my superior, the coordinator, very much understood the human factor of things going bad, and generally she gave everyone in the office around one pass per year or so for monumental fuck-ups. That was mine back then, and because it was quickly solved, there was no panic, no repercussions, nothing. But of all 30, 40 something shows I worked on simultaneously in the course of the 2 years working there, not only did I make the mistake again, I made the same mistake on the exact same show, with the exact same producer, the same actors, and mostly the same crew. So not only am I sitting there instantly realizing just how bad things are, I'm also coming to the obvious conclusion that there is no getting back from this for me. Same show, same mistake, and this time way worse. No slap on the wrist this time. If anything, I'd be lucky if I don't get sued, which, if I had been a private contractor, as I had been many times on other productions, would have definitely happened. Now, if there's going to be any lesson to be learned from this story, this here would be it. And it's something I learned the first year I started out as an AE, when I made another, considerably smaller mistake that had pissed someone off. Without getting into that other incident, what did happen back then was that I called my parents to seek their advice when I knew I messed something up, but I didn't know how to fix it. And my parents told me at the time, in a sense, that everybody screws up. People will always make mistakes, but fundamentally, there's two ways they can piss people off. You can piss someone off by making a mistake, but being upfront and honest about it, or you can make a mistake and then make excuses, shift the blame on someone or something else. One will show that you at least have the integrity and honesty to admit your wrongs, the other shows that you're a lying weasel on top of having messed up. And with that lesson in mind, I went ahead and accepted my fate. After 10 minutes of contemplation, I called my superior, she asked what was going on with the footage, and I just broke it to her right away. I said, yeah, I fucked it up. Because of this mistake the year before, she immediately understood what I meant, so she asked, are you serious? And with no emotion at all, I just said, yes, the footage is gone. I fucked it up. And I could hear her immediately starting to panic on the other end. She started cussing under her breath. She said she had to make a couple of phone calls and that she'd be back to me. About 20 minutes later, I'm in a Zoom meeting with her and a couple of other colleagues to assess the damage, and she was crying. Understand that, from her perspective, she had to go to the top office, talk to the boss, and explain that a member of her own team made the same stupid-ass mistake he had done the year before, and how, because she's in charge, she's also technically responsible for this. There was nothing I could do at that point, although I did tell her that the least I could do is walk up there myself and explain it myself, but it didn't really matter. If anything, me going up there instead of her would make it look like she's avoiding responsibility, or worse, that she barely has any control over her team, and it might hurt her even more if I go there myself. So, after everything was assessed, I was told to simply finish my work for the day, and that we would talk again tomorrow. Before I got back to work, I called my parents to tell them what happened, and they basically told me the same thing again. I told them I was pretty sure I was getting fired over this, but they were more optimistic. They said that at least I was honest and upfront about it, and that might just be the saving grace. I also called my girlfriend, and she was more in denial about it than I was. I explained it to her, and bless her heart, she immediately started making excuses for me. What if they never gave me the card in the first place? What if there had been a glitch of some kind? And I had to stop her at some point. I said, like, dear, listen to me. It's done, and it's my fault. There's no fixing this. That's all. Jump to the next day, and I'm home doing chores, still expecting to show up to work later short of getting a phone call, and lo and behold, my superior calls me and says she has to let me go. I'm getting 2 weeks severance pay plus whatever vacation money I had accumulated, and that's it. I never kept anything at the office, so I never even bothered going back there again. That said, she was very polite about it. She didn't sound angry, just really sad and disappointed. And I just felt empty. I just accepted it. First time in my life I was fired from anything, and it could not have been for something as worst or as stupid. The worst part of it though was the timing itself, because at the time I was in the process of looking for a home to move into with my girlfriend and her child, and it's difficult to do, without a proof of employment, one which I had just lost. So I had to look for another job immediately. And in this rather low moment, I asked my former coordinator, do you think I can ever get another job again after what just happened? And she told me essentially that if she was asked about my time there, like as a reference on my resume, she herself would not mention the screw up to anyone. And that right there was probably the real saving grace of being honest and upfront with my fuck up. Pretty sure if I had started arguing or making excuses, everything would have been considerably worse. But as it stood, they preferred to let me go quietly, and none of what happened ever came back to haunt me, fortunately. And surprisingly, about a month after getting fired, I was moving into my current home over the weekend and starting a new gig as an assistant editor in a different production company. Back then though, I already knew I wasn't cut up for this anymore. The whole experience didn't really do anything to shake my confidence. As far as I was concerned, I was still a really good AE who could salvage the absolute worst footage and somehow still make sense of it for the editors, even when camera crews did nothing to help. It wasn't because I was incompetent that I fucked up, it's because I didn't care anymore. If there are any editors or anyone who knows a bit about editing listening, you've probably wondered, like, wouldn't it have been obvious when I was preparing the footage that two cameras were identical? Like, if two cameras were the same, you'd see it instantly in the monitor playback? And like, yeah, you would, but I wasn't looking. Not because I was blind, but because I was so fed up, I couldn't be bothered to look. I wanted to get my work done as quickly and with as little issues as possible because I couldn't take it anymore. So I rarely ever looked at the footage when syncing it. I would look at the audio waveforms, which, when you have three cameras in the same room recording audio at the same quality, is always going to look similar. So I never went beyond it. If anything, the most surprising thing in all of this is that it didn't happen sooner. Pretty sure the way I was headed, if it had not been that one prep, it would have been another eventually. And if not, if I managed to do everything right, then it's probably the burnout that would have done me in eventually. And it's mostly a thing I realized after it went down. The next gig I got initially gave me hope that I could recover from this blunder, and I was working on this cop show which felt similar to 31st Precinct. So I was like, at least the footage won't be boring me this time, I could find the passion again. Except it was boring. What little I watched from the show while working on it felt poorly written and so full of cliches, so I immediately lost interest. That job was also an evening job, but it was far more likely to end later into the night, and by then I was living with my girlfriend and my stepson, who is neurodivergent, and so it became preferable that an adult always be in the house when he is, just to make sure everything's okay. Problem is, if my girlfriend started work early, which she did, and I came home at 4 in the morning, I would have to be the one getting up at 7 to make breakfast and send him off to school. So what should have been a fairly easy gig turned me into an absolute zombie because of my sudden new family life, which in turn made me realize that crazy post-production seasons are pretty easy when you're a young adult living on your own, much less so when you have a family and the responsibilities that go with it. And so, between a total lack of interest in my career and a family routine that gave me much less flexibility, I started looking for alternatives, and I asked myself, was there a way I could use all of those technical skills I learned over the years, but in a way where I can work from home, on my own hours, on projects that I actually care about? And well, at this point, you should probably guess what I ended up doing. About 4.5 years ago, after getting that gig on that cop show, I was offered to extend the contract all the way to Christmas, and I turned it down. Instead, I went back home, started working on my YouTube channel, and eventually I had to start working retail to pay the bills. If I'm being honest, I think I'm in a much better place now than I was when I had that big fuck up, but the worst thing in all of this is that my current job pays me less today than my first assistant editor job did 7 years ago. But would I go back? Hell no. Not as an AE, I've had my fill. As something else though, like a director? Maybe, if my movie ever pays off. But that was the story for today. It was pretty long, but you try and tell 5 years of your life into less time than this. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and hopefully whatever mistake you make in the future won't be as bad as the one I made. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.